Well, look, I think they're engaged in some type of reform, right? Is it what I want? Is it what most people who want democracy or liberty, or to see change in Cuba, what they want? No, of course not. But what is certain is that the Cuba of today is very different than the Cuba of just a few months ago. And that as a general rule, what they're doing increases civil society, and that is having an impact which they are trying to control. Undoubtedly, you know that their final goal is not to have a type of pluralistic capitalist society like lies 90 miles away. They have another goal. One is to remain in power and control, but at the same time create enough wealth internally so that they can sustain the regime, something that they are in a very difficult sorts to do. That said, you have to recognize there's something going on in Cuba, and I think we have to be in favor of those changes. Obviously, we'd want to see more of them, but we can't ignore the fact that things are changing in Cuba. Well, I think that, interestingly enough, not by design, but by simply inertia, by the concept that your family comes first. And I think that they're having a huge impact, right? First, just on the normal human level, it is right now probably Cuba's major source of income. We're in Versailles, so we got to have coffee.
Please go ahead.
Major source of income right now. If you look at the derivatives of Cuban-American remittances and shipments of goods, it is probably the largest sector in the economy. It is the greatest multiplier. It is the one that flows the most through the economy because, for example, when Europeans travel to Cuba and they buy hotel packages in Europe, a huge percentage of that cash goes straight into government coffers and doesn't circulate in the Cuban economy. Unlike when Cuban Americans travel to Cuba or send remittances in, that money takes on a life of its own inside of Cuba and multiplies itself many times. And so they're having the impact that they're growing the private sector of the Cuban economy, or the black market sector, although the Cuban government is trying to get control of that, or at least loosen its control so that they can get a better handle on it. And I think that is the first impact. Secondly is simply support. I mean, the ability that the measures in place right now, I can send $500 to Giovanni Sanchez in Cuba. Just FedEx, Western Union, that money to her. And that is going on, and it's going on in a huge scale, both by individual supporters of human rights activists and by organizations which are engaged, I think, in a very noble cause, which is to try to help civil society in Cuba grow. And I think that's a very commendable role, a very different role than the role of the exile community, say, 40 years ago, where they were engaged in an armed struggle, albeit tremendously ineffective. One had to at least recognize that it was occurring. I think right now what you're looking at is, I think, a broad realization that the actors to Cuba's future, the main leaders are going to come from Cuba, not from Miami, and I think that's good. Oh, absolutely. No, the money that the U.S. government puts into this is peanuts. And you know, I am supportive, and I help create these programs. So there will be a especially dark, dingy place in hell reserved for me for the impact that it's had, because I think in many respects it's overshadowed what is truly going on. Groups that have been very effective and efficient in helping certain dissidents on the island get through. And but that said, one shouldn't simply give up on the program. And I think the Obama administration has tried to reform it. I think they're having some success. And I think that's the classic example that they're having effect is now not only is the Cuban regime against it, but the right wing in Miami is against it. So you know that the truth must be, this is being served somewhere in the middle there. Yeah, well, because the Obama administration has restructured the programs and basically, you know, has made them more efficient, made them more goal-oriented as opposed to some type of ephemeral political pleasing of the right wing in Miami. These programs now have a sort of directed purpose at expanding civil society, not anything beyond that. I mean, the high points of the absurdity is at one point the U.S. intersection had an election in Cuba for who would be the best president of the United States. I mean, only Fidel Castro could have thought of something more absurd and more to his point of what American assistance is for, to make Cuba some kind of dependency. But it is because the debate and these programs were being run in such a Miami-centric fashion that they became, well, huge wastes of money. Look, to some degree, obviously Alan Gross is in jail because the Cubans put him in jail. But the fact that Alan Gross was involved in these programs was a reaction to the Bush administration's all the money that was being misspent by the Cuban-American groups in Miami. And of course, the Cubans picked Alan Gross because they could make noise with Alan Gross. If they would have, if they would have caught Joe Garcia distributing computers in Cuba, who would have, everybody said, look, he's a Cuban, he knew what he was doing. In Miami, I would have had my detractors. And in Cuba, they said, look, he's associated with the Cuban-American National Foundation. Let's give him 1,000 years. But it wouldn't have created the tension that Cubans get with Alan Gross. What they look for in Alan Gross is exactly what they got. A point of argument with the United States, which is what they need. It's where they've been wonderful at. David versus Goliath. There's no one that's played that better since David himself. The problem is that they had it their way for a very long time. Tens of millions of dollars were spent on these programs. Just like radio and TV Marti, which had become ineffective and ineffectual, and I think the administration has reset it up so it's an information group as opposed to some kind of resonance box for discussions that are going on in Miami. And I think that makes sense. When Radio and TV Marti had a larger payroll in the Cuban-American community, particularly in journalists, which was exposed, what you got was a repetition of the administration's position, not only in Miami, but of course in Cuba. And I think that's truly unfortunate. The way that they gave out these funds, I think they were looking to do a change, right? To have something more effective. And they put it in hands of professionals. Again, I can't speak for the foundation grant because I didn't help write it. But I do know that the foundation's been engaged in this since 1992, right? When I was at the foundation. And one of the precepts that we began at the foundation, because of all our missteps, at least while I ran the foundation, was we wouldn't pick winners because we had been burned. We had done it, right? When we created there was one time where we created an umbrella organization for the human rights groups. And then they had an election among themselves. And they elected this guy, which we thought, was Mascanosa from the Malecon. I mean, he literally was sending back what we sent him. And it turned out this guy, whose name was Hector Castañeda, he was a lieutenant colonel in the security force. And of course, he arrested the entire dissident setup that was there. And I smile when I say it because it was so obvious when you took a step back, right? They had, his speeches worked in Miami, not in Cuba. And I think that taught a valuable lesson. It certainly taught me a lesson when I took the helm at the foundation. I said, look, whether I agree with Elizardo Sanchez Santa Cruz, or whether I agree with Osvaldo Payá, or whether I agree with Marta Verdi-Roque, what we're going to do across the board is be helpful. And we're going to be helpful in simply giving information, letting them know what's occurring, opening up a dialogue with them. But the circumstances and the debate that they're engaged in is about them. Look, I mean, one imagines that that's very possible. One also imagines that the circumstances of the Cuban regime are very different, right? This is a very, very centrally controlled economy. The resources that the Cuban government manages are very, very precise. I remember once meeting an East German. He said, they took our system and they did it one better. right? There was an old a political prisoner that used to said, you know, you take 2,000 years of Oriental totalitarianism using the Russian and Chinese models, and then you add 500 years of caudillismo, and you get this very special system whereby the dictator, there's not only a cult of personality, but he's personal and familial, right? So Stalin is a fictitious name that means steal, you know, and he's removed from you. Fidel is a guy sitting next to you at the table. He's first person personal. And so when Cubans speak of this regime, the impact is not only complete, but it's familiar. And so it makes it very difficult. And then secondly, it's an island, right? So if you misstep, there's no way to get ahead of it. You're stuck. So it requires a tremendous amount of courage. And then finally, when you put it all into that context, because of its familial nature, it's also applied that way. So Joe Garcia mouths off, and his sister, who's got a nice job at the foreign ministry, suddenly gets laid off, right? And so the very act of Western courage, which is very typical to the European, and it's very typical to the United States, whereby, you know, one morning I get up and I'm going to have a fight with my boss simply because it's his turn, right? Here, you know, you get a call from your sister who just got laid off from the foreign ministry because you mapped out about the regime, and she said, "Tell me how we're going to eat from now," right? Because but that said, you know, we saw regimes that were very total and very brutal see change. So I mean, I think that it's possible. Obviously, what we don't want is violence. What we don't want is people hurt, and I think it's all possible, and obviously we want change, but clearly what we want is things to continue to change regardless. The Cuban Revolution was exceedingly violent when it came to power, and it was pretty bloodthirsty. I mean, there's a lot of blood. But I also know what happens in Miami, right? And in Miami, there's been exiles coming for 50 plus years. The great perpetrators, according to the Cuban government, the Venturas, the Martin Perez, they died here in hospitals, no security guard, nobody exacted the last vengeance. You know, if Cubans were Italians, I would say to you, you know, but even then, I just think, I mean, I hope that there won't be violence. Now, do people talk about violence? Yeah, but, you know, as a general rule, Cubans are loud, boisterous, and gesticulating because they want to avoid the actual confrontation, right? That's not saying that when Cubans confront, they can't be brutal and effective and efficient. I mean, the Cuban army is probably one of the best military instruments in Latin America. They pulled off with two empires, the Soviet Union and the United States had trouble doing. I mean, Afghanistan destroyed the Soviet Union, and Vietnam almost killed us, as did Afghanistan and Iraq. Cuba went to Africa twice, won 2 wars, and returned home victorious. And this is a small Caribbean country. So I'm not saying that they're not capable of violence. What you hope is that the humanity of these relationships, the expansion of civil society, the realization that when Tracey Eaton goes to Cuba to see his wife's family, the guy who's head of the block committee, he gets some of the goodies that Tracey brings also, simply because he's part of the community that takes care of his family. And so that reality, which is, by the way, almost always been part of Cuban history, I think you hopefully is going to have impact. But you also know that a lot of the violence has to do with the impotence, right? I always say that if you listen to Cuban-American politics, the rhetoric is more like somebody watching a sport, right? You know, it's almost violent, right? It's sports rhetoric. We got to kill the manager, this pitcher, we got to let this guy go, we got to cut him off, you know. Very aggressive, because of course we're sitting in the stands. We actually aren't actors to this game. And I think that that's been true for almost half a century. And so I think what also happens, as you've witnessed, is when people go to Cuba, they also come to a realization of just how difficult things are, how much these people have suffered. Sort of the guy who still walks around with his land claims, and he not only wants his farm back, but the burro he left tied under a tree, right? And of course, there is no farm, there is no burro, and if we gave it to him, he wouldn't know what to do with it to begin with, because he's 90. And I think that reality, right? So I sometimes try to say this to people when they're not high, right? So I say to imagine you're here in Versailles and you're having a coffee and you look over and there's a gruffy old man with a walker trying to get a coffee. And you look and shit, it's Fidel Castro. And so the question is, do you beat up an 84 or 85-year-old guy who's got a walker? Do you take a stick to him? Or do you say, you know, the next coffee, give me extra sugar, maybe a diabetic coma will take him, but you're not going to beat up an 85-year-old man. It's sort of like Pol Pot, right? When you saw him as a lump of human, but not necessarily the perpetrator of one of the world's worst genocides. And I think that reality is something that hasn't set in here or there, right? Because Castro has been this total figure, right? In Miami, it isn't this way, but in Cuba, he literally, the history books, he invented a country in their history. He's been the arbiter of every major argument, has inserted himself into everything he can, and is personal. But the reality is, he's an old man, and this is over, and he's part of the past, and we're going to have to deal with that at some point. You know, to some, the chagrin may be that this will be the Cuban Beowulf 1,000 years from now. I hope not. To others, as someone said to me, this is a guy who was president of Cuba at the time the Bambang created some of their greatest music, right? Because I have a tendency to believe that Cuba will be remembered for its music and not its politics. And so you've got to put that into perspective. But if you distill it, right, there's something horrible that happens 90 miles from here. We are obviously very attuned to it, and we want something better to happen to those folks. But the whole setup of where we are is that I think a new generation is taking stock of things there and here, linked intrinsically, because one of the difficulties and benefits is that U.S. immigration law is being applied today the way it was created, you know, a century ago, which is immigration is husband, wife, minor, children. Well, the problem is they haven't built any new housing in Cuba in 40 years, and so, you know, when you get married, you move your wife into your house, and then you have a child, and your unwed sister-in-law lives at home, you know, and you create this sort of family that's massive. And so a lot of people work and live sending assistance and aid to people in Cuba, and I think it's creating a much more rational relationship as opposed to an ideological relationship.